Hey LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show brought to you by the LinkedIn News team where we're talking as a community about the changing nature of work. I'm your host, Caroline Fairchild, coming to you from my home office here in New York City. It's Tuesday, August 25th, and here's a quick look at the top stories that professionals are talking about right now on LinkedIn. Protests against the police shooting of Jacob Blake, a Black man, extended into a second night. The National Guard was called into the town of Kenosha, and the Wisconsin Department of Justice is investigating the incident. Blake, who was shot in the back several times, was in stable condition at a nearby hospital on Monday. And as various coronavirus federal relief programs are set to expire, an increasing share of Americans are facing homelessness and hunger. The programs help an estimated 17 million people stay above the poverty line during the pandemic. 22% of Americans have faced food insecurity since the crisis began. That's according to Brookings. For more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. And if you're on mobile, just click into the search box. That brings us to the main story that we have for you today on Business Unusual. While workers around the world have been impacted by the crisis, by many measures, working women have been the most heavily impacted. Women were more likely to lose their jobs at the front end of this pandemic, and those who kept their jobs were more likely to be in frontline positions, such as nurses or caregivers, who are more susceptible to getting the virus. Meanwhile, working women who stayed at home throughout the pandemic faced an increased share of both household chores as well as childcare duties. A recent LinkedIn survey of workers across the country found that working mothers are among the most stressed out and anxious about the prospect of having to return to the office at this stage in the pandemic. On today's show, we'll speak with two experts from McKinsey who have been tracking how women have been impacted throughout this pandemic and beyond. A recent report by McKinsey shows that 75% of the world's unpaid work is done by working women. And if women were to play the same role in GDP as men, we could see an increase in GDP to 28 trillion by 2025. McKinsey's Mekla Krishnan will join us, as well as Anu Mudkabar. They're both going to join us on today's show to walk through this report, as well as how the pandemic could impact working women beyond this pandemic as well. But before we bring on our guests, we want to hear from you through the poll that we have for you on the show today. We've been polling members on the LinkedIn news page about how their share of unpaid work has changed since the pandemic began. How are they doing more household work and childcare duties since this pandemic did begin? We want you to vote in the stream right now, A, yes, B, no, or C, depends. But also let us know in the stream what you're doing at home right now that maybe you perhaps were not doing before the pandemic. We'll reveal the results of the poll at the end of today's show. And with that, I want to ask Mekla as well as Anu to join us in the stream. Hello, how are you? Thank you both for joining us.
Hello, nice to be here.
Anu, I'll start with you. Talk to us a little bit about the jobs of women were more susceptible during this crisis, and how does that compare to pre-COVID times?
So I do think that in the midst of this crisis, COVID-19 has devastated lives and livelihoods of many people all over the world, but women have been particularly hard hit. And we set about to just try and quantify and understand to what extent women were more vulnerable. And it was actually quite startling for us to find that, based on the data that exists, that women are 1.8 times as vulnerable to job losses as men are in the middle of this crisis. So if we looked at the numbers globally, for example, and though women account for about 39% of the global workforce, we estimate that they would account for about 54% of global job losses. So it's a disproportionate burden in terms of unemployment, and the root causes are, a few. We can dive into them, but just upfront, that's startling. And this comes on top of already a lack of parity in the workforce that existed even before the crisis, as well as, I think, relatively slow progress, particularly on closing the gender gap in terms of workforce participation. So on top of that, to be set back in this manner is really not good news for gender parity or for economies and societies.
And Anu, let's dive into that a little bit more. In terms of gender parity, how has the pandemic set back any efforts globally to reach gender parity, say, in industries that have been progressing towards that before the pandemic began?
Well, a variety of industries have been hit in different ways in the pandemic. So just to focus first on what's been most hit, what's interesting is that women and men typically work in, you know, slightly different sectors. So there is a concentration of women in certain sectors and a concentration of men in other sectors or types of occupations and work. Women tend to cluster a little more in healthcare. They have a larger share of sectors like accommodation and food services, retail trade, and so on. Now, what's interesting is that these are the sectors that have been, in some way, in some shape, been relatively more affected by the COVID-19 crisis. As healthcare workers, women have been very much at the forefront. Their services have been very much, in need. But if you think about their roles in accommodation and food services or in retail trade, for example, these are actually sectors where revenues have dropped off the cliff thanks to COVID. People haven't been able to go out, right? And therefore, with 70 to 80% drops in industry revenues, employment in these sectors has been very hard hit. And this explains about 25%, roughly one fourth of this disproportionate hit that women are facing thanks to COVID. On the other hand, women have been doing better in some sectors like financial services, for example. And traditionally, women's role in financial services has actually been increasing. That's a sector that has lent itself to some of the COVID-related, wave towards remote work. And to that extent, you haven't just had the situation where women can't go to work because of physical restrictions on mobility.
And Mikla, I'll bring you in here. Anu's talking about seeing more women go into positions of leadership in finance during this crisis. That's certainly different than what we saw during the last recession when we saw a decrease of women going into those services. Talk us through how this crisis is different. And as we go and think about a recovery, is it going to be quicker than the last time around when we saw women just regress in leadership positions across industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe just to start with, Anu described what explains about a quarter of the gap, right? Which is the disproportionate impact coming from the fact that women are in certain sectors that are disproportionately impacted. They work in accommodation, they work in retail trade, etc. But what explains the rest of the three quarters? I think we need to do more work to understand this, but our initial research would suggest it's a combination of a few different things. So firstly, it's the fact that women, as you said at the start of the segment, women do a disproportionate amount of unpaid care work in the home, and that includes everything from cooking, cleaning, housework to things like childcare and elder care. Globally, they do about 75% of the world's unpaid work. In countries like India and other parts of South Asia, they may do 8 times, 10 times the amount of unpaid work that men do. So in this particular crisis, where so much of the crisis has manifested as work from home, so much of the crisis has manifested as an inability of children to go to school, so on and so forth, that's created a disproportionate burden on women. Other things, though, could also be driving some of this. There's some really stark data from something called the World Value Survey that has surveyed respondents to say when jobs are scarce, should they go to men or women? And what we find is that when we look at many developing countries, more than half of respondents say that when jobs are scarce, they should go to men. Even in developed countries, up to about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 respondents say that job scarcity means that jobs should go to men. So all of these factors mean that there are specific challenges that women frankly faced before COVID, but that in a COVID time are exacerbating the problem for women and could mean that a recovery back could be slower. I think in a way there's a risk, but also possibly an opportunity, right? I think if we lose some of the momentum that we've seen companies gain in the past few years, we stand to lose some of the progress and the gains. But there's also many things that we put in place during COVID, and we can talk more about that later, but things we put in place related to flexible work, related to an understanding that people's work lives are a part of their home lives and the broader experience that they have. And so bringing more of that to work. So I think there's a lot of potential headwinds from this. I think that the key for companies is to make sure that the tailwinds don't overwhelm that.
Right.
I'd just like to jump in on the question of women in leadership, Caroline, which you also alluded to. I think that's super interesting because on the one hand, with remote work, one would think that many knowledge-based occupations are relatively untouched by the crisis, right? And in fact, women in some walks of life, for example, heads of state or city mayors or governors, have been at the forefront in terms of positioning and conveying a sense of leadership through this crisis very effectively. But on the other hand, it's also true that with the unpaid care work burden increasing so sharply, that even for women in leadership positions, when earlier this might have been something that they could contract out through hiring services like childcare professionals or home health aides and so on to help share that burden. Now that's really not possible. And some of the biases that Mekhala talked about do come up. So things like, one study suggests, for example, that, board appointments and board elections of women actually slows down in a crisis. And this is because some of those traditional choices that are made in organizations about, who should really get the opportunity, or, expecting women to kind of prove themselves based on past performance rather than future potential or promise, some of those biases actually tend to take over in times of crisis. And women, even in a remote work context, actually find it a little harder to do things like the informal networking and stuff like that, which is actually quite important to reinforce your softer power or softer networks in an organization. So that was a bit of a problem anyway to begin with, and now it perhaps is exacerbated by the current circumstances.
Mm. And for those of you who are just joining the stream, this is Business Unusual, a live show where we're talking about the changing nature of work. I'm here with two experts from McKinsey breaking down how women have been unfairly impacted by this crisis. I want to go ahead and say hello to some members on the stream. Rhonda from Mississippi, Cindy from Illinois, Estone from Atlanta, Susan from Dallas, and Scott from Seattle. We have Kim joining us in the stream saying that she has school-aged kids at home. Costs have gone up, but work has gone down. She's always on call, stress has increased, pressure increased, and she can't apply for full-time work due to kids' schedules and health conditions. Kim, thank you for joining us on today's show and for joining us in this discussion. Mekhala, let's talk a little bit about what the report found in terms of how white women are being impacted by this crisis versus women of color. What did the report find, as we know that women of color tend to face even more of the brunt of the crisis like this one?
Yeah, so we've done a variety of work that has looked at the corporate pipeline. So looked at everything from entry-level positions all the way to positions of leadership, and broken that down across men and women, as well as across people of color versus white men, white women. And what we find is that in general, even to begin with at the start of the funnel, people of color may be underrepresented in many jobs in corporate America. So for example, at the very start of the funnel, white women may make up about 30% of employment. And then you think about all the way to the very top of the funnel, jobs in the C-suite, and they make up about 18%. So about 1 in 5 CEOs are women, white women. However, if you contrast that to people of color, maybe at the start of that funnel, at the very entry level, they may make up about 18% of all employees. But by the time you get to the top of the funnel, they make up 4% of all employees. So that's 1 in 25 CEOs being women of color. And so what that means is that even before COVID, the drop-off for people of color, for women of color in particular, was especially steep. Went from 18% at the start of the funnel to 4% at the very end. And there were already challenges pre-COVID. And now we have COVID that's hit. And as you were alluding to at the start of the segment, there are sectors that workers are in that may be disproportionately occupied by women and disproportionately occupied by women of color that are affected as a result of this crisis. And so when you just think about job losses, that in particular could be challenging for women of color. You overlay that with some of the COVID-specific challenges, things like balancing work, but also balancing childcare. You overlay that with the fact that oftentimes what has happened with workers is that their wages have been reduced, their hours have been reduced. And we know that women in general, women of color in particular, may have lower savings, so a lower nest egg to manage and sustain themselves through crises. And all of that starts to put particular pressure, not just on women, but on women of color in particular.
And the report, it talks about just these best in region gender parity improvements. And if we got to these best in region gender parity improvements, trillions could be added to the economy by 2025. Can you break down for, say, the average member on the stream, what that really means and what that looks like on the ground?
So what we did is to really try and put a value at stake to the whole question of why does it matter, right? That we have to correct this sort of gender regressive scenario that's panning out, because it is important to express it in economic terms. Not that there aren't a host of other important reasons, which may be not economic, to sort of narrow the parity gap. But economics does matter, right? So what we did is we thought about a situation first in which some of the disproportionate burden that women today are facing in terms of job losses are allowed to pan out unaddressed, right? So they continue, women drop out of the workforce to the extent that they have, and they don't really come back. And relative to a more gender neutral impact of the pandemic, this would be $1 trillion less in terms of global GDP by 2030. So the world would be sort of $1 trillion less in terms of output and so on. But on the other hand, the best in region scenario that you talk about is the one where we said that what would happen if every country actually took steps now to address some of these barriers to women's participation, get women back, and raise women's participation rates, not to the theoretical maximum, but simply raise them as fast as their neighboring country has actually managed to achieve over a decade. So there is a sense that someone in my neighborhood has actually done this and has done it faster and better than me as a country. What if every country just emulated that level of improvement in women's workforce participation? And in that scenario, GDP would be $13 trillion higher in 2030. And depending on the country, that's between 8 and 16% higher. So it's a very significant economic prize. It's 230 million women who would be in work in 2030 relative to the 30 million odd who would actually drop out in the base case or the do nothing scenario. So this really matters to global prosperity. It really matters to women, and it really matters actually to women's families as well, because there are a host of other benefits to families and societies if women are successful and thrive in the workplace.
Just building on that, often as we speak with companies, the sense is, can we afford to think about diversity and inclusion at a time when we have so many other things that we need to deal with? And our sense is, if you think about the long term, if you think about resilience and recovery from this crisis, it's almost like you can't afford not to, right? So there is a huge economic opportunity. Other research we've done has also shown that companies that are among the top performing quartile in terms of diversity and inclusion also outperform their peers. When you think about companies' imperative to attract the best talent, to think about serving their customers in the best possible way, to think about broader resilience and ability to sustain themselves in crises. What we feel is, like, from an economic and a financial standpoint, this is a crucial lever that companies have at their disposal, just a crucial opportunity they have to withstand the crisis and recover more strongly.
I want to go ahead and bring in some comments that I'm seeing in the stream. Sarah says multi-generational families are especially hit hard. We're dealing with high-risk parents and school-aged kids at home. We're on high alert and coping with these challenges and losses in income. Thanks for bringing these issues to the conversation. Sarah, thank you for joining us on today's show. Mekhala, one of the big issues that we hear on LinkedIn and what we're seeing, particularly as offices start to reopen, is working women feeling challenged because schools are not reopening in a lot of parts of the country. And so they're being asked to say, should they continue to do this unpaid work that they've had to do throughout this crisis, or can they keep their job? What are best-in-class companies doing to support working parents right now through your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think especially, there was the short term 2 or 3 months when people said, let's withstand it, we can bite the bullet. But now, as it seems to be increasingly something that's going to be with us for the next 6 months or beyond, I think we are going to have to rethink what this new normal looks like. And I think there's a few different types of things that it's important for companies to consider. The first is, of course, things around flexible policies, and a lot of companies have put those in place. But what we find is that employees still feel like their immediate manager, while the company may have a policy in place, their immediate manager may not completely understand the policy, may not actually fully adopt the policy. So I think it's important to think about what is the set of flexible policies you put in place, but also how do you ensure that employees, managers fully understand and adopt and implement these policies successfully. So that's one thing. The second has to do with how you, in the long run, start to deal with things like employee burnout, employee isolation. I think we need to have more conversations to do with mental health than we have had historically as a result of this crisis, and really think about the disproportionate impact it might be having on diverse populations in the workforce. The third is, companies really starting to think about what is their role to play maybe beyond their four walls. When we think about balancing things like childcare, a lot of that has to do with rethinking whose responsibility that is. And we at least need to start having more of a conversation around how do we change attitudes about roles in the home versus roles in the workplace, and make this quote unquote burden that we keep referring to actually one that is shared appropriately between both men and women in the household.
Yeah, I'm seeing some comments in the stream from Andrea talking about stress management and how to stay mentally healthy during this time. So I think that's a really great point, Mekhala. Anu, what solutions are you seeing on your end, and how are they differ from, say, what companies were doing to support women, say, in pre-COVID times?
I think at this point, for many of the better performing companies who have advanced the gender parity agenda or the diversity agenda within their firm, even in pre-COVID times, I think some of those companies are really thinking about this as a moment that they can seize to actually, get even better, right? And a few of them are actually thinking in a forward-looking way to say that at some point, so of course we'll do everything we can to tide our women employees over through this difficult period, be supportive, support flex, signal that flex is quite normal, signal that even men should consider going on flex through this difficult time. So of course all those things, but also thinking about, well, what happens and how do you really keep women engaged and motivated through this to come back even stronger. And therefore, this includes a few things like making sure that new opportunity creation is very visibly seen to be open to and encouraging of women to step up and take those roles even now, and certainly thinking about how to make the comeback to work sort of easier and more productive, right, for lots of women. So that's one. I think the second is to bring a bit of an emerging market context to this. I think there is the other crisis of women as small business and micro enterprise owners, not just employees of large corporations. And when you think about such women, I think again there's an intersection of challenges. There's unpaid care work, but there's also far lower financial resources. Sometimes people are competing within the household for access to digital bandwidth and technology. So the argument about who gets to use the mobile device or who gets to use the internet, right? So these things do come in the way of women as small business owners as well. And this is something where, again, some companies are stepping up, to Mekhala's point, to think about what they can do for women outside of the four walls of their own organization, but ways to support women in the community a lot more from a small business perspective.
And Mekhala, I'm just talking about all the great things that some companies are doing to advance gender parity during this crisis. But what else are you seeing on your end? We've focused this discussion a lot on the problems that working women are facing, but what makes you optimistic about the opportunities that, say, corporate America has right now to even the level playing field for women?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I am an optimist, so I like to see the silver lining in things. I mean, I think, look, it's an amazing thing that overnight we entirely changed the way we work, right? Of course, not everybody had the luxury to benefit from that, but for many of us, we were fortunate enough to be able to work from home, to bring flexibility to our lives, to reduce the daily commute, for me as a consultant to travel a whole lot less. And so there were all these positives that came with the crisis and with new models of working, and they also happened overnight. So it shows us that when we think about change can happen relatively quickly. This issue that we've been talking about now for years and decades and saying it's a really hard problem to solve, but we've shown it is possible to do behavioral change overnight. So I think that gives me hope. I think that the caution I would have is, it's very easy in times of crises to forget about issues like this, to focus on the near term and the immediate and the urgent, but forget about what's the longer term important. And I think it's important for companies to use this, as Anu was saying, as a time to invest for the long term. I also think, just given the nature of the crisis, the fact that a lot of this has led to job losses, we need to think about the diversity and inclusion agenda beyond just in the recovery, beyond just thinking about how we support employees today, but also things like how when it comes to the recovery, when we think about rehiring workers, so many women that have lost jobs, when we think about rehiring workers, how do we do that in a way that is equitable and allows women to enter back in the workforce in a smooth way? And then how do we think about things like performance management reviews? A lot of the stress that we're hearing from employees is that they worry about the implications of this for their long-term career prospects. So, a lot of this is using the existing pre-COVID toolkit, but really thinking about it in a new way in a post-COVID world. And I'm optimistic that companies can do that successfully.
Well, Mekhala and Anu, I know I speak for the members in the stream when I say thank you for joining us today on Business Unusual. Jesse says, we all live at work right now. It's so hard to be present for family and present for work, especially with young children in elementary school and homeschool requirements. These are great conversations. Anu, Mekhala, thanks for all of your research and for your insights here on Business Unusual.
Thank you very much to LinkedIn and you. Thank you.
That was Anu and Mekhala from McKinsey walking us through a recent report that they authored around how working women have been impacted by the pandemic. I want to thank them for joining us on today's show. And now I want to reveal the results of the poll that we shared with you at the top of the show around unpaid work and how the pandemic has impacted it for you in the stream. We're seeing a vast majority of you say, yes, you are doing more unpaid household work since this crisis began. We have votes for yes from Bala, Ayu, Himanashu, Julie, Andrea, Hashan, Mekhala, Kim, Sarah, Karen, Greg, and Dolores. Thank you all for voting on the poll today and for joining us on today's show. This is Business Unusual, a live show coming to you from the LinkedIn news page where we're talking about the changing nature of work every weekday. Tomorrow, my colleague Susie Jackson will be with you to talk about how much more people are working out from home. Yes, everyone is working out from home right now, but a recent New York Times survey found that people are exercising at home even more so than before. Tomorrow, Susie will talk to 2 virtual fitness experts about what they're seeing from their clients. So be sure to check that conversation out on the LinkedIn news page tomorrow at 12 Eastern. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much for joining us.